So much NFL news out there, and the draft is a week from tomorrow. That's on top of the fact that the draft is 1 week from tomorrow. Some key big names are in the news today. We will dive into it all with the Eagles Insider, NFL reporter, and of course, you can read all of his NFL news and notes and Eagles news at 973ESPN.com. Follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. He appears every day at this time on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline as the NFL draft 1 week. The Eagles had some players meet yesterday. Tomorrow, the front office, the Howie Roseman and Doug Peterson. So a lot of stuff happening. John, what is going on?
Doing well. Just gearing up for the big Howie press conference, as you mentioned, tomorrow. He'll meet the media at about 10:15, and we can hear all the subterfuge about the draft. It's not going to tell us anything, obviously, but you try to cajole things. One of the things I'm interested to ask him is about his time away, and I think one of the stories people don't talk about enough is that Jeffrey Lurie allowed him to travel, and he would go talk to people like R.C. Buford from the San Antonio Spurs, Brian Cashman from the New York Yankees about how to build a successful organization, and it's obviously worked out for him.
Yeah, and, obviously tomorrow they're going to talk a lot about the draft. Let's get a little bit into that situation because, with the Eagles drafting at number 32, it really, has changed from where they've been the last couple of years. They have been really in the top 15. They've moved up. They've made the, trade to get Wentz where they were number 2. They had the 4th pick in Chip Kelly's first year. So there was a lot of conversation about particular players that they might be targeting or interested in. When you're drafting at 32, it's a much different scenario here. However, how much is this spot at number 32 a desirable spot for other teams, meaning that the Eagles right now, do you think there will be a lot of action on their phones leading up to the draft and on draft night because of where they're drafting?
Yeah, there usually is at 32, and I talked about it a lot. The difference between 32 and 33 is that 5th-year option year. So if a young player hits and becomes successful, you basically have that extra year in the back pocket. You don't have to worry about it from a contract standpoint. So it's always a very desirable position to go up and get, especially if there's a quarterback there, because you want that 5th extra year in case. So it's a good position to be in.
Yeah, and, if you're drafted at number 32, you're basically looking at position of need or something like that. And quite frankly, where would you rank the Eagles' position at need? And do you think they are such a need that staying at number 32 is imperative?
No, and I still think it's unlikely that they'll stay at 32 because they don't have a second in a 3rd-round pick as we stand here today. So I think they want to get back in the draft, and the easiest way to do that would be to fall back a few spots and pick up extra picks, hopefully an extra 3rd-rounder or something of that nature. So I still think that's the more likely scenario, but the caveat is always if a player falls that you love, you got to take him.
Right. Do you think – now we've hinted at a couple of players just in kind of passing in the past, but are there specific type of players or any certain players that you think at 32 that they would be intrigued by or like?
Yeah, I think there's a couple, and there's a couple natural positions. One is running back. I wrote about that today.
Yep.
On 973ESPN.com for a couple of reasons. This is the final year on Jay Ajayi's rookie contract. He's got sort of that chronic issue. And then there's the mentality in the NFL. I think this is even bigger part is you never want to get to that second contract with a running back. You'd prefer to keep churning it and have 4 or 5 years with a young running back that is cost effective. Unless you're talking about a superstar like Ezekiel Elliott or somebody of that nature, but Jay Ajayi's not that. So I think that's a natural position. I think if you look at offensive tackle, we've talked about slot cornerback. We've talked about tight end, even linebacker for a guy like Kyle Vander Esch, who's got some injury issues now if he starts to fall. Those are some of the positions you have to look at.
Hey, John, do you think that they are comfortable or confident or comfortable, I just put those words together, in expanding Corey Clement's role, or do you think they want him to stay in a similar – in other words, if they're drafting a running back, does that basically say we want Corey Clement to kind of be a bit player, much like he was last year?
No, I think it has to do more with what I explained from the contract standpoint and the fact that, look, if you get to a second contract with Jay Ajayi, that probably means he had a pretty successful season here, and that probably means you're going to have to pay him a lot of money. And the theory around the NFL is you don't want to pay running backs a lot of money because they do have such a short shelf life. So I think it has more to do with that. I think they're very, very happy with Corey Clement. I think they believe he has a chance to be a very good running back. And he's obviously, as a young player entering his second year, he's under team control for a far longer time than Ajayi. So he's a big part of what they're going to do in the future. It's just one of those positions. And remember, they went running back by committee last year. Well, Garrett Blunt is no longer here. Darren Sproles probably not going to be here, depending on what happens in the draft. So there are some open spots.
John, there's been a lot reported about Deuce Staley's interest in guys like Darius Guice or Sony Michel. League circles talking about the possibility that the Eagles, if they do stay at 32, could add a running back. You heard rumblings. Now, listen, the Eagles were winning last year, so you didn't really hear a lot out of Jay Ajayi about splitting carries, and he kind of assumed that this year would be his year where he's the lead guy. But if you draft a running back at the end of the first round, a Darius Guice, a Sony Michel, somebody like that, obviously they're going to do running back by committee, but does that still upset a guy like Jay Ajayi who thought that it would be his turn to kind of be the lead guy?
Probably a little bit, because I think he would see, he's not a dumb guy. I think he would see the writing on the wall from what I just explained from a contract standpoint, and would kind of know he's a bit of a lame duck. But some of that takes care of itself by the fact that whether he's here or not in 2019, he's going to have to perform well for other teams. So a lot of that takes care of itself if they do bring in a running back. But, yeah, I mean, if they take one at 32, and you mentioned some of the names, that guy is going to be expected to be a pretty significant contributor early on. And I think in a lot of ways it'll fall sort of like it did this year towards the end of the season when Ajayi got here. And Doug Peterson will go on field. He'll have specific packages set up for the specific backs and what they do well. And you'll see that rotation. And it's understandable why the Eagles are comfortable with it because it worked so well for them last year.
John, when you look at this draft as a whole, and you look at the big picture for this offseason, for this draft for the Philadelphia Eagles, is it really just, okay, we want to get young guys in here because we know that maybe Malcolm's getting older in the tooth or Rodney's getting older in the tooth, or you just mentioned with Jay Ajayi's contract, they need to get young guys in here? Or is it just you want to continue to kind of not have so many picks but still build the foundation of already what you've established on this team?
Well, it's always important, especially for a team like Philadelphia that has salary cap issues, and not only this year but also next year. When you look at the contracts they have on the books moving forward, the best way to combat that is with young players, and because they're cost effective for those first 4 years. So from that standpoint, as far as building your roster, every team wants those types of players, but it's more important for teams up against it from the salary cap. And right now the Eagles got about $1.7 million, and next year is even worse when you look at the contracts on the books. Now, we always talk about Howie Roseman, his ability to manipulate contracts. He'll continue to do that moving forward. But what makes that easier is if you do hit on young players. And young players are, as I said, very cost effective. So if they become contributors and you don't have to sign a veteran, even to a minimum vet deal, that saves you anywhere from $500 with incentives, maybe $700,000, and that's important.
NFL Draft 8 days away. John McMullen here on the Sports Bash Live, 97.3 ESPN. Let's look a little bit at the top of the draft here, John. And as we stand here today, do you have a good indication from where we were about a week ago where Cleveland is looking? They have picks 1 and 4, so they can get creative.
Yeah, I think there's been some speculation that maybe Josh Allen will overtake Sam Darnold for that number 1 overall pick. I don't believe it. I think Cleveland has been set in on Darnold for a while. Ultimately, I think he'll go number 1. Then you have to see how the board falls as far as who's going number 4. If it goes quarterback, it's pretty easy. Then you go Saquon Barkley, despite those kind of silly reports that he's trying to get steered away from Cleveland. If something else happens, the Giants take Barkley or Bradley Chubb, which is at least a possibility. I still can't believe they would give up the opportunity to take a quarterback, but we'll see. Then obviously things change. But
what if they legitimately, the Giants, don't like any of these quarterbacks, isn't the smart decision to say, look, we're just going to get out of the quarter? I mean, to say to draft a guy just because they're in a potential rebuilding situation, even if they think that guy's not going to be any good, if they don't like a guy, isn't it smart not to take one of those guys?
Yeah, it's always, you never want to take a guy you don't like.
Right.
But if you look at it as a whole, I mean, this is one of the deepest quarterback drafts in recent memory. If you don't like a quarterback this year, well, you're in trouble. I mean, it's very unlikely you're going to face a similar. Let me put it this way, Mike. It's very likely you're going to face a similar situation and be in the top 5, but it's unlikely you'll be able to get a quarterback you can get this year in the top 5. So how do you want to go about it? I mean, part of it is, no doubt, we talk about this a lot of years. It's very rare when you go Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, you can go Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, those 2 most recent drafts. There are always position players that are higher rated as far as their football acumen for their particular position. Last year, Myles Garrett was unquestionably the best prospect in the draft. But the reality is, and I constantly talk about it, Myles Garrett could be Bruce Smith. He could be Reggie White. The top ceiling of that. It's unlikely, but if he develops into a Hall of Fame player, he's still not as valuable as, say, a Deshaun Watson. If Deshaun Watson becomes what we all think he's going to be, and a 10-year starter in this league that's very effective, it's just more valuable.
So what do you make? Yeah, go ahead.
And it's not to say you're not criticizing Myles Garrett, much like this year I'm not criticizing Saquon Barkley or Quentin Nelson, who are the 2 top position players in this draft. It's the reality that the quarterback position is that much more important than running back or offensive guard.
So what do you make of Sean Payton's comments? I feel a bit uneasy. If I were at the top of this draft and decided I had to have a quarterback, I wouldn't be surprised if only one of those guys is left standing in 4 or 5 years. And if so, I guess it would be Sam Darnold.
Well, I think part of it is he's hoping one of them falls to him. You downplay quarterbacks, especially, Drew Brees is obviously going to the Hall of Fame, still playing at a tremendously high level. But the Saints need, much like the Patriots, they need an heir apparent. And this is a very good draft to potentially get one because you have 6 guys. That 6, Mason Rudolph kind of teeters between the second-round grade and the first-round grade to some people. Maybe one of them falls to you if you talk them down. And
by the way, the Saints drafting
nobody takes them.
The Saints are drafting 27th. That's a lot. That's a pretty precipitous fall.
Exactly. It's happened before, though. Most notably, you look at the Alex Smith, Aaron Rodgers year, which nobody thought sort of that highly of those 2. But one was going to go number 1 overall, ended up being Alex Smith and Aaron Rodgers started tumbling and tumbling and tumbling. I think he ended up going 22, I think, or 23. And yeah, that worked out pretty well for the Green Bay Packers.
John, we were having this conversation a little bit earlier, and I say it all the time. You just alluded to it where you talked about Deshaun Watson and what we expect him to be. Well, this time last year, nobody was talking about Deshaun Watson being anything like that because of his style of play and where he came from college and all that. It starts, but to me, it starts where if you take a young quarterback, you need to cater to what he does well while he develops the other parts of his game that are weaknesses. And I don't think a lot of NFL coaches go into this thinking that. They want to put a square peg in a round hole and say, listen, if he can't adapt, he can't adapt. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it.
No, it's a terrible way. You're 100% right. The best example of that is Jared Goff. Year one under Jeff Fisher, that's what it was. And Rob Boris was, okay, we're going to put you here. We know you're not good as a pocket quarterback, but this is what we run. This is what we're going to run. And then Sean McVay comes in, completely revamps the offense, sort of develops a almost college-like check with me type system. And Jared Goff starts excelling. You're right. I mean, there aren't a lot of prototypical quarterbacks coming out of college today, and what we think about it in the past as pure pocket passers and guys who can sort of Peyton Manning types that can read a defense and manipulate things at the line of scrimmage. If you're looking for that, if you're hoping for that, you're going to be waiting a while. So the good coaches, to me, and Chicago made a mistake last year, very similar to Jared Goff and what we just talked about. They took a very raw kid in Mitchell Trubisky, traded up to get him, only one spot, and all of a sudden he comes into the system with John Fox, a defensive-minded head coach, and Dal Loggins, sort of a let's be kind and say a below-average offensive coordinator, and they did a terrible job with him. And now they have to start from scratch and reboot, bring in Matt Nagy, who's going to, he's been with Andy Reid, he's from that tree, and I think he's going to do a lot of similar things to what Sean McVay did with Goff, and even here with what Doug Peterson and Frank Reich and John DeFilippo were able to do with Carson Wentz, and get them going in a positive direction pretty quickly. But you're right. If you draft a quarterback, you're in the top 5, top 10. The whole basis of your organization should be moving in one direction, and that's to maximize the talent of that particular quarterback. And too often, teams don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned it. And another thing is that, I mean, Carson Wentz, he had all the intangibles to be great, but people forget that Carson Wentz, Doug Peterson basically said, listen, we are going to do what we have to do to make Carson Wentz successful. It wasn't the other way around where it's like, okay, we're going to try to make Carson Wentz something he's not. And you just see around the league so many times that it's like, okay, well, this guy can do this, but he can't do this and this and this. And then he gets to a team like Johnny Manziel or all those guys in Cleveland where the coaches never really try to adapt or help these guys be successful. And I think that's where the league is kind of needs to change.
Well, I think the better examples would be, as I mentioned, Goff and Trubisky. I'm not going to blame the Browns for Johnny Manziel. I'm going to blame him for taking him. But that kid was just a train wreck off the field. He was not going to succeed. He had too many issues with substances of his choosing. But, yeah, I mean, you're right. And with Carson Wentz, and even more so with Nick Foles, who was a veteran, the Eagles revamped their offense when Carson got hurt. Took them a couple weeks, and when they realized, remember the mantra when Carson Wentz went down, and Doug Peterson had that press conference, sort of almost a wake-like feel after that injury. The day after, he said, nothing changes. And nothing did change. And he was pretty good against the Giants. He was terrible against the Oakland Raiders. He was terrible in one quarter against the Dallas Cowboys. And then that's when John DeFilippo went to him and said, look, Nick, what are you comfortable doing? What do you like to do? What do you like to run? And the Eagles showed up against Atlanta in the playoffs completely different with those RPOs and the quick passes that he was so successful with when Chip Kelly was here. and that's a veteran quarterback. So I think, to me, the definition of a good coach has always been a guy who maximizes the talent of the players he has. You always have systems. You need to have a DNA as a coach.
Right.
And it's good to have a system. But the reality is you're never going to have a perfect fit at every position for what you want to do. So you have to take advantage of the players you do have. And then as you go along, get as many players as you can to fit into the system that you want to run.
John McMullen, tomorrow we might spend more time on this, but I do want to get your initial thoughts. We went back and forth on Twitter this morning regarding the tanking story in the NBA. My question for you is, and I don't really see tanking in the NFL as an issue, but is there tanking in the NFL? I don't think there's a really good example of teams tanking because I just, quite frankly, don't think the draft is as scarce as the end. The reason there's tanking in the NBA is because the scarcity of talent in the draft. The NFL doesn't have that issue, so teams aren't trying to lose because they don't need to get one particular transcendent guy. So do you see tanking as an issue in the NFL?
No, there's a rare instance where you'll see sort of tanking maybe for down the stretch of the season when you see everything is already gone. And the closest being was the so-called suck for Andrew Luck. That was a legitimate tanking, but it also came that was sort of like the Spurs Tim Duncan tanking, and that David Robinson got hurt. So they got lucky. Peyton got hurt, and they were terrible anyway. So they just kind of skated that along. And more so, I think, than anything else, though, why you don't see it in the NFL is because you don't have to tank. And we see it every year. The Eagles, last year, they're the Super Bowl champions. They went from worst to first. They were last place in the NFC East. So the difference, Mike, you and I probably talked about last year, people were talking about the Dallas Cowboys coming off that season and Dak Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott and saying, oh, they're going to be good for years and years and years. And the Eagles are in trouble. And all of a sudden, here we are this offseason, the Eagles are the Super Bowl champions.
Right.
That's how quickly things change in the NFL and how quickly things can change. So unless you're the Cleveland Browns, and they're not tanking, they're just terrible decision makers.
Right.
It's not really, I mean, when Sashi Brown, you saw some of the NBA mentality of collecting as many assets as possible and getting rid of, some veteran players. But they thought things were going in the right direction.
They're not essentially tanking for a particular player. Like in the NBA, you're tanking because you want to be able to be in the market to draft Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid or Karl Anthony Towns. In the NFL, unless there's that super superior
type.
Exactly.
Yeah, Andrew Luck would be the last example, and that happens maybe once a decade.
And the only reason that happened is because Peyton Manning got hurt.
Yeah, but there's sort of that type of prospect, I mean, where everybody is sort of like 100% on board, and they know this guy's going to be a superstar. And even that, obviously, I mean, Andrew Luck was well on his way. I think you can argue he was a superstar.
Yeah.
But he's had so many injury issues, we don't know what he is right now. But he did win the 11 games in 3 consecutive years and got him to the AFC Championship game right away. So I think that you can say they were right about him. But that prospect is rare in the NFL, where it's just a flat-out, no doubt about it guy.
All right, John, follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. He appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. More NFL news and notes on tomorrow's show. Thanks, pal.
Thanks, John.
Hey, thank you, guys.